Hello, Stitchers. This is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and I am so glad you are joining me as we start to stitch this one meaningful word hoop. Every year, I design a hoop that lets you choose a word that encourages you or has special meaning for you, like some of these. But this year, I've also decided to add some short phrases as well. So if you want to do that, or you can leave off the word box and just have a floral hoop. You get to decide. Regardless, this design is made up of what I call sort of a half modern, half bohemian color palette. And it has some very simple stitches along with a little bit of needle painting, some wool felt, these gorgeous pink beads, and hot pink yarn, and a few stitches that might be new to you. But before we get to the fun thread and stitches, we need to transfer the design onto this gray fabric. Now, if you bought a kit, you can skip to the next chapter in the video if you want to. And a note about chapters. You can scrub your cursor across the progress line at the bottom of this video and see the chapter titles. That's really convenient if later on you're looking for a very specific topic in a video and want to go straight there. But what you're going to see next is a tutorial that, in addition to being a part of the video for this specific design, will also be its own separate video if you ever need to come back to my YouTube channel and if you want to see again how to transfer a design onto dark fabric for a future project. So, here we go. Hello, Stitchers. This is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and welcome to this tutorial about how to transfer an embroidery design onto dark fabric. Now, if you're like 95% of the people out there, you don't really like to transfer patterns onto the fabric. I know, I get it. It's tedious. I'm the same way. I just want to get to the fun part with the pretty threads and the fun stitches and all the pretty colors. But you got to get a pattern on there somehow, right? And the method that I use most of the time when I'm using a light colored fabric is to I'll just quickly go over that method, is to print out the fabric, print out the design, cut it out, stretch my fabric on the hoop, tape the pattern behind the hoop, and then shine a bright light behind it and trace it on. And you can very easily see, even a kind of an intricate pattern like this, you can see all these dark lines and you can trace it onto the front of your fabric. But if you have a fabric that is a little bit different, that you cannot see the lines through the fabric if you shine a light behind it, you need to use a different method. And I found this method to be very accurate, and it just has a couple of steps to it, and so it's not that hard, and it works really well. So let me talk about the fabric first of all. The one I'm going to be using today is a quilting cotton, but it's this gray. And I could probably get by with tracing it on with a bright light, but I just wanted to make sure that I got all this detail and I wasn't struggling too much. So that's why I'm using this method. If you are using, like, stitching on a linen fabric is really, really wonderful, but it presents a couple of issues. Tends to be a little bit thicker sometimes, and it very often will have a texture to it. And that kind of nubby texture can present a problem when you're trying to shine a light through it from behind and see through it, because all that texture shows up as all these crisscross lines and it interferes with you seeing these lines. So, like, here's a linen that is dark, so it has sort of a double whammy. It's dark, well, triple whammy. It's dark, it's a little bit thicker, and it has the texture. But even on a linen like this one, which is a light color, if this was just in a regular cotton fabric, this color would not be any problem at all to shine the light behind it and trace. But it is thicker, and if you can see how it has that very textured, nubby effect to it, that's going to be really almost impossible. You're just not going to be able to see a pattern from behind with a bright light. So let's use this method. The supplies you will need: the fabric, obviously, a hoop. You will need a ballpoint pen. You'll need a white gel pen. You'll need the pattern printed onto paper. And you will need white graphite paper. And this is like an artist's graphite paper. It is used to transfer line work onto wood or metal or paper. And it's I will probably refer to it as carbon paper half the time. So, but anyway, technically the package says graphite paper, and it works just like a carbon paper. It has the paper side, and then on the other side it has, um, it's almost like a waxy, chalky, you know, coating on it. So let me talk briefly about, just very quickly, let me talk about the hoop. I carry these hoops in my shop. I love them. They're so nice. They have really nice brass hardware, and that's what the screwdriver is here for, so that when I'm tightening my fabric, I can put the screwdriver in there and I can tighten it down really tightly. And that is important because you want your fabric stretched very tightly. I know this isn't about fabric stretching, but let me just get my plug in here for always making sure your fabric is stretched super, super tight in the hoop. That makes everything easier. Tracing or transferring the pattern on will be more accurate. Your stitches will be more accurate, and you won't constantly be tugging on the fabric. And so using a good quality hoop can help that. Also, if you notice, I have the inside of this hoop wrapped with cotton twill tape. And cotton is important because you don't want it to be something slick. But I've just wrapped it and I've hot glued it here on both ends. And I've just made sure it's smooth all the way around. And then what that does is that allows the inner and outer hoops to squeeze the fabric more tightly, and it gives this inner hoop a little bit more grip. That's why you don't want to use like a shiny ribbon. So that once I pull it tight, this way, and then I stretch it, and then I tighten it right here, that fabric stays like a drum the entire time I'm working. So no more struggling to keep my fabric tight. So let's get down to the details about exactly how to do this process. And I have now stretched my fabric in the hoop, and you can see that it is absolutely as tight as it can be. I've also trimmed it off, and I have used pinking shears, scalloped pinking shears, to trim off the fabric so that all that fabric doesn't get in my way and so it doesn't unravel. And I have cut out my pattern, and I have also cut out a circle of carbon paper. And the size that you want to do is you're going to flip the hoop over and figure out a size that fits right inside the hoop. And you don't really want it to climb up the edges. And you also want to make sure that it is big enough that it covers all the way to the edge of where your design goes. So this one works out that if I just kind of do it just a teeny, let me get this out of here. Once you cut this circle out, you can cut this circle just a little tiny bit smaller than this circle. So now that I have those, the method is there's my top, and I'm going to place the graphite paper onto the back side, onto this side of the fabric. And let me talk quickly here. I like to stitch with my hoop and my fabric facing up like this. Some people are happy stitching like this. It doesn't really matter. It's whatever works for you. But I just generally prefer to have my fabric facing like this as I'm stitching. But when I am transferring the design with this method, I need to flip it over so that I can have this on a hard surface, so that when I am tracing this design, I can press down really hard. If I was tracing it like this and I press down, the fabric, even though it's really tight, it has a little bit of give to it, and I'm not going to get as good of a transfer. So for now, I'm going to transfer it like this. After it's all finished, all transferred, I will flip the fabric this way, and then I'll begin stitching. So first step, flip the hoop over. Take your carbon paper, and you'll need to figure out which side is which side is the graphite side and which is the paper side. And if you just feel it with your fingers, this side, the graphite side, has a little bit of it's not sticky, but it's just a little bit, tiny bit waxy. And this side is real smooth, and your finger glides right over it. So those creases won't matter. So I'm going to just place that centered like that, making sure it's right in the center. And now I'm going to take my, also let me show you this. This is a previous piece of graphite paper that I have used, And you can reuse these. It will still, the more you use it, the less of the graphite is going to transfer. But maybe you can, I don't know if you can see that, hopefully, but you can see how I've got at least, I think I've used this one at least twice. And you can see how the design they just trace right over each other, and it worked out fine. I could probably get, maybe depending on how dense the design was that I was tracing, I could maybe get one or two more transfers out of this. So don't feel like you have to use this and then toss this one and use it again. You can keep using this until it's just not showing up anymore. But for this demonstration, I wanted you to really be able to see what I was doing. So I'm using a fresh piece of graphite paper. Now I'm taking my printed design, and I'm going to lay it on top. And I am picky about how my transfer, I think it goes just like that. I like it to be centered. I know it's just a thing with me. So I am centering that, and now with the pattern facing up, now there's one other supply I forgot to tell you you're going to need, and that is just 3 or 4 pieces of this tape, because I need to tape this in place. So I'm going to put it on the paper, rub my finger, rub it on the inside of the hoop, the top of the hoop, and then stick it onto the paper. I just don't want this to shift while I am tracing. And I'm going to try not to cover up too much of the lines, although it doesn't really matter. You could cover that with the tape and it's just not going to really get in the way. But, 3 pieces is plenty. I just have made sure that I have, right here, I've really pressed it down hard onto the fabric, and I've pressed it down really hard on the inside of the hoop and on the top. If I just kind of slapped a piece of tape on there, then this could still shift a little bit, and you don't want it shifting. You want it to stay in place the whole time you are working. For the next step, you're going to need a little bit of hand strength, because what we're going to do is we're going to use our ballpoint pen to trace over these black lines, and we're going to push hard enough so that the graphite, transfers onto the fabric. Now the fabric, even though it's a smooth fabric, it's just a teensy bit rough, and you're going to feel that as you're tracing. And the reason we're using a ballpoint pen is because it has a rounded, a ball point, and so you can push really hard, but it's not going to tear the paper. You could probably use a pencil, but if I had a pencil that was like super sharp that I just sharpened and I was pressing really hard, first of all, I might break off the tip of the pencil, and I might also tear the paper. So that's why a ballpoint, just a regular old cheapy ballpoint pen, is great for this. And I printed this out in black, and I have done it before where if you have access to printing your own patterns, on your printer, I switch the color. I either reduce the opacity or I make it like a very light pink so that when I am tracing, I can see where I've traced. But I didn't do that here. That's fine, not a problem. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to hold this down, and I'm going to trace over the lines, pressing very, very firmly. Okay, I'm really pressing down hard. And I've traced over these lines. I'm going to trace over everything on here, and the reason that I sometimes print it in a different color, because sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell where you have traced or where you have not traced. But just take a good look at it after you trace everything with the ballpoint pen. It also helps. I'm using a blue ballpoint so I can tell what's blue versus black. But I'm going to take a really hard look at it after I've traced all of these lines, pressing down very firmly, which is why, like I said, I needed it to be flipped this way so I could really press down hard. Trace over all your lines, take a good hard look at it, make sure you've traced over everything, and then we will move on to the next step. One other quick note that I wanted to mention before I move on is that the surface, the table underneath, is important too, because you are pressing so hard, and you know, it's just going through this fabric, you don't want to, you want to have a nice hard surface underneath your hoop. If you're using this pen and pressing down really hard, and if you have like a wooden table, you could easily leave, you know, an indentation in that wooden table. And this is actually a piece of like almost like foam core, and it's sort of soft. And if I were to proceed, I would not do it on here. I'm going to move this, and I'm going to use my work table that has a really nice hard surface that's not going to be ruined by pressing really hard as I trace all of these lines. All the lines are traced with the ballpoint pen, but before I just rip off this paper and the carbon or the graphite paper, I'm going to do a little check first. I'm going to carefully lift up the edge here, and sometimes it's hard to get your fingernail under there, so I just am using a needle. And I'm going to pull up both the graphite paper and the printed pattern, and I'm going to check to see if my lines did transfer. And I'm going to put my hand behind it so you can see, so it's dark. So hopefully see those lines right there. They're very faint, but they're there. So that tells me that I put the graphite paper down with the correct side down, and that I pressed hard enough to see those lines. And now I will go ahead and take off the paper, the printed pattern, and the graphite paper. Now that I've taken off the pattern and the graphite paper, there's all of my lines that have been transferred on. But there's one more step I need to do. I need to go over those lines with the white gel pen. And the reason is, yes, I can see these, especially if you put something dark behind it, so there's no light shining behind it. So yes, I can see these lines, but they are a little bit faint. And if you wanted to start stitching right now, you could definitely do that. This graphite doesn't, it sort of rubs off. It's not like chalk where it's going to just completely disappear if you like barely rub it. But it's pretty light, and I don't want to struggle the whole time I'm stitching this to see those faint lines. And particularly as you get more stitches on, it's a little hard to see the fainter lines next to what you're stitching. So I like to go over it with the white gel pen. Let me talk to you for just a moment about the white gel pen. These are great. It's an opaque ink, so that's why it shows up on dark fabrics. They're great for paper as well, but they can be a little bit finicky. So when I store these, I store them with the tip down so that the ink is always down here in the tip. If you store it up, it can kind of go down to the other end of the pen, and it's kind of hard to get that ink flowing. And talking about getting the ink flowing, I always keep a little piece of, it doesn't have to be the same color of fabric, and it could even be a piece of paper, but if you have a little scrap of the same fabric that you're stitching on, that works too. So before I get going, I will make a few lines, and you can see that it's not showing up really great at the beginning. So if you kind of keep making some lines, it gets a little bit brighter as you are working with it. And sometimes as I'm tracing over those lines, I will come back over here, or I'll wipe the tip off because that ink can get a little bit dry. But generally, if you store them with the tip down, they work pretty well, and I don't have a whole lot of trouble with them. So now all there is to do is just carefully go over the lines that I traced with the graphite paper. And sometimes I will go over the lines twice if I really want it to be brighter, a brighter white. And at first you might not think that it's really tracing, or it's not making much of a difference. But if you compare it to the kind of light lines that were left from the graphite paper, you can definitely see that it's brighter. And once I've gone over all these lines, I have never had any trouble being able to see it while I'm stitching. So let me bring that up to you so you can see it. So see the difference between the graphite lines and the gel pen lines. So it's really worth just a little bit of time to go over it with the white gel pen. Another consideration of the white gel pen is that it is permanent. Neither the graphite lines or the gel pen lines are going to wash out. They're not going to disappear with time, and you can't use heat to get them out. They are permanent. So I trace very carefully, and I mean here I flubbed up, but it's not going to matter. It's all going to be covered with stitching. But if I have like a line where the stem is going to be, I make sure to trace very carefully, both with the graphite paper and now again with the gel pen, so that I am going to be able to stitch over that line and cover it completely throughout the whole pattern while I'm stitching, because these lines will not go away. I have finished tracing over the graphite lines with the gel pen, and this is what it looks like. So if you are someone who likes to stitch with the hoop facing this way, then you can just get stitching just like this. If you're like me and you like to stitch with the hoop on this side, then all you need to do is just take the fabric out, restretch it, and you are ready to go. Before we can start stitching, we need to get the word onto the extra piece of fabric that we're going to apply to the gray fabric that has the pattern transferred to it. And so now I've transferred this on and I've taken it out of the hoop, and for just a moment, before I put it back in the hoop, I'm going to leave it out because we have to do this first. So choose your word, obviously, and then what I have here is my word printed out. I have just a small piece of cotton fabric. This is in the color I think is called bone, but it's just an off-white fabric. And I have a little piece of Wonder Under. And if you were with me for the stitch along that we did back in November of the moth, for the carnival moth, we used Wonder Under before, and we're going to use it again. So that's what that is. And I have cut this piece of Wonder Under so that it just fits inside the size of the piece of the fabric that I've cut out, that where our word's going to be. All right, so it doesn't matter what size your off-white fabric is, just make sure that your Wonder Under is smaller than that fabric, but large enough to cover the word. So I'll set that aside for just a moment. And now what we're going to do is trace the word onto this fabric. So I've just cut this fabric to be big enough to fit over my word. I am going to tape it down again so that it does not shift. So just do some quick tape right here. Little piece on the side. And now, because this is a white piece of paper and a very light colored fabric, I can just see that word right there. I could put it up against a window if I wanted to shine a bright light behind it, and I could see it even better. So if you're having trouble seeing these little tiny letters, they're pretty small, put it on a light box or just pick up this whole piece of paper and tape it to a bright window, and that light shining behind it will make it even easier to see. But I think, hopefully, I'm going to try to do it like this. Let me see if I press down. Can you see how you can see that word through there? I'm going to try it this way. I may have to go put a light behind it, but we'll see. So it is very important what kind of pen you use to transfer the word and the box onto this fabric, because we are going to be ironing it. So you cannot use a Frixion pen, which is what I normally use to transfer my designs on, but this goes away with heat and we're going to be ironing it, so can't use that. You can use, I would recommend something with a very, very tiny little fine tip. This is a Micron Pigma, what is it called? Pigma Micron. This is the 01, but it comes in an 03 or an 05. Those would probably be fine too, even though they're just a teeny bit bigger. But it has a very, very fine tip on it, and it will not be affected by the heat of the iron. So really, you could use a pencil. You could use a very sharp pencil, or if you have, this is a mechanical pencil I have. These have a very fine lead in them, so that would probably work too. But I really just, if you have a little marker, a permanent marker that's not a Frixion, I like it because it's going to be a nice thin line and it's going to be black so I can see it. So I'm going to go trace this onto the off-white fabric. Now we need to get the Wonder Under on the back of this fabric. So I am going to remove it from this piece of paper, peeling the tape off. Ruining the piece of paper in the process. Anyway, I'm going to make sure that I get all of this tape off because I do not want that on the fabric when I am ironing. So that's all of the tape gone. And so there's our piece of fabric that has the box and the word written onto it, traced onto it. Here's my Wonder Under. As I mentioned before, make sure you cut it a little bit smaller than the piece of your fabric. So if you were not with me before on the Carnival Moth, let me give you just a brief description of what Wonder Under is. It's a fusible that allows you to iron one piece of fabric onto another piece of fabric so that it will stick. So it has a paper side, and then on the other side it has kind of it's a little bit rough. It's not webbed really, but it's just like a, I don't know what, like a glue, an adhesive that's been sort of sprayed on this side. So there's a rough side and a paper side. I am going to take my fabric with the traced word. I'm going to flip it over, and I am going to go in there to my iron. I'm going to put the rough side down. That's extremely important. Do not leave the rough side up because that's the adhesive, and when you go to iron it, it will stick to your iron instead of the fabric. You don't want that. You want it to stick to your fabric. So I'm going to make sure, and the reason that I don't cut it larger than the fabric, because if it hung over the sides, the edges here of my fabric, like if I ironed it when it looked like that, then when I iron it, it's going to stick to my ironing board. You also don't want that. So when I iron it onto this fabric, I'm going to make sure it is inside the edges of the fabric, a little bit smaller. It's on the back side of the fabric, and the rough side is down. So here is the Wonder Under ironed onto the back of the fabric. And next thing we're going to do is to cut out this box that goes, the rectangle around the word. And I've traced it, I designed it so that you can cut just inside this black line. I mean, like just a hair's width inside, so that black line doesn't show. But it's fine if it shows. But I'm going to cut this out very carefully. I have some really sharp scissors. But it's just straight lines. Just like that. Okay, so cut that box out, and we will move on to the next step. Here is my word, and the Wonder Under is still in the back. And now you need to just peel off the paper backing of the Wonder Under. And sometimes this is easy and sometimes it is not. And I'm really going to test myself here. Sometimes I've found it's easier if you get it going with, I'll take a little needle and I'll just put it between that paper and the fabric like that. That is usually easier. And I'm trying not to wreck the corner of the fabric. This is kind of a small piece, but now all I need to do, put that needle away, all I got to do is just peel the paper backing off of that. And now, even though it looks the same, it has kind of a smooth finish to it. On the back of my fabric, I now have an adhesive. So the next step will be to take my pattern where I have traced the design on, make sure I've got the right side, what goes up, and I will place this on the fabric right where I want it. I don't think that's quite right. I'll spend a little bit of, oh, it goes like that. That's what's different. It goes like that. And I will get it right in place. And now I will take it to the iron and I will iron this on. And I realize I forgot to tell you how long to iron it. When you are ironing the Wonder Under onto the back of the fabric, I'm going to use a medium-high heat, and I think it's about 8 seconds or so, 5 to 8 seconds to put the Wonder Under onto the back of the fabric. And then for this stage, because you've got a piece of fabric in between the adhesive, same thing, medium-high heat, kind of, or a high heat. I just use it, put it on cotton, and set it. I mean, I would iron it for about maybe 8 to 10 seconds. Let it cool, and then check these corners. You have to make sure and let it cool, because if it's warm, it will peel up. Let it cool, and then see if the fabric has been adequately melted. You know, that Wonder Under has melted onto the fabric, that adhesive. And this is such a tiny piece, it's not going to take a long time. It's not like you're doing a big, huge piece. So it shouldn't be too hard, but just make sure it's completely adhered onto this fabric. One last thing about ironing the word onto the fabric is that it's not a bad idea to use a press cloth on top of this while you're ironing it. This white gel ink is not going to come off on your iron. It is permanent, because I've tested it. It doesn't smudge or melt or anything, but it's still not a bad idea. So a press cloth is just this is just another piece of white cotton, and just lay it on top. You know, get your word, get the rectangle right where you want it to be, and then lay your press cloth on top. You got to be really careful when you're laying the press cloth that you don't shift the word a little bit, because you don't want to pick it up and have it be right there. So get it right in the right place. Spend a little time. When you put the press cloth down, put it down very carefully. Make sure that word doesn't shift, and then iron it on. Let's work next on this center flower, this whole center section. And we already have the word ironed down on this separate piece of fabric. And we're going to leave that alone for the moment, because first what we want to do is to stitch the flower that looks like it's underneath the word, the rectangle with the word. So to do that, to start out, we are going to use all these pretty blues and purples and the satin stitch. Now, there are two types of satin stitch. There's the kind that what I call parallel satin stitch, where all the stitches sit in a row right next to each other, all lined up. They don't cross over each other. Then there's this kind, which is what I call satin stitching in an arc. And, you know, you could definitely stitch each of these petals where every stitch was all in rows, parallel rows, you know, like if you just drew straight lines straight like that. But what we're going to work on here is satin stitching in an arc. Now, on my YouTube channel, I already have a satin stitching tutorial that is all about satin stitching in parallel lines. And it's definitely worth a watch, because it has lots of very good basic information about how to either learn satin stitching or to improve your satin stitching. If you're not happy with it, how to get it really nice and smooth and satiny. And so definitely worth watching that. And depending on when you are watching this video, there's going to be a part 2 that is specifically about satin stitching in an arc. So it might not quite yet be up, depending on when you're watching this, or it might already be published. It just depends. But let me show you briefly what I am talking about. I'm using 3 strands of DMC thread, and you know, you can satin stitch with any number of strands. For this size of shape, I have found that 3 strands works up pretty quickly and still stays pretty smooth. Now, I like to draw guidelines that will help me as I stitch across the shape, that will help me know like how to adjust my angle as I work around. And so I have taken just a Frixion pen, and I have drawn guidelines. I started out with the middle one because it's easy to determine, because it's straight. And then I just hopped over to this side and I made that one kind of like this is the point and they're all coming out from it, or like the center of the flower itself is the point from which they all radiate. And then those right there. Some people like to come along and put a stitch, you know, make stitches across the shape when they're satin stitching, and that's fine if you want to do that. I just usually tend to mark my guidelines, because I like to work straight across, I mean, all the way in consecutive order from left to right. You can work from right to left, left to right. If you want to hop around and do some stitches, that's okay too. But for me, I have found the most consistent satin stitching I get is when I work from one side across to the other, so I know exactly where my stitches are going. All right, so let's actually do some satin stitching. Now, these over here are little bitty stitches, but I'm still trying to keep in mind those angles. And on these shapes, I am not putting any kind of outline down first. I'm not stitching over an edge because I know that I am going to eventually be outlining each of these shapes with a stitched edge. So I'm going to be covering up these outlines. Because of that, that means I don't have to just be really overly precious about what my outlines look like. There are times when you want to be really, really careful about where you bring the needle up and where you put it down on satin stitch, because it makes a difference, because it's going to show. It's not going to show here, so like see here, like see between these, or any of these really, but see how there's sort of a space right there, and you can sort of see the gray fabric in between those two shapes. That's fine. That doesn't matter, because I'm going to cover that up with some stitching later. But I still want my stitches to be smooth and neat. That one was probably a little far away, so I am going to hop back, put one stitch in right there. There, that filled in that space. All right, I'm coming up on one of my guidelines, and you can see I'm working at the correct angle. And so far, they've pretty much been side to side. But the difference between, well, when you're working in an arc, there are going to be times you're going to need to adjust the angle of your stitches. You can't just, they can't all sit exactly side by side. So let me put this one in, and then I'm going to show you. Okay. So this arc is not a very drastic arc. It's a pretty smooth, gradual arc, so I'm not having to do this a lot. But sometimes you might need to come through. This is, let me do a couple more stitches here. Put one right down the center. I haven't had a whole lot of need to do this yet, but let me show you. So sometimes, like right here, if there's less room down here than there is right here. And by that I mean you have to fit more stitches down here than you have to fit across on this line. So in order to adjust for this angle going from here to here, I am not going to make a full stitch on my next stitch. So I'm going to come up right exactly just next to that stitch I just made. But instead of going all the way down to the edge, to the end here, and making a full stitch, I'm going to shorten that stitch and put it just slightly under the stitch I just made. And what that does is it makes kind of a more of an angle this way. So now for this next stitch, I can come all the way and make a complete stitch down there. And it sort of covers up that partial stitch I made, and now I have more of an angle this way. But I'm not all crowded down here by having to fit more stitches in. I'm going to do the same thing now. Come up right next to the stitch I just made, and instead of going all the way down there, I'm going to shorten that stitch and put it slightly, I'm not shortening it like, way up here. I'm shortening it down here closer to that end of the stitching. So now I've adjusted that angle a little bit more this way. So now this stitch, same thing on the outside, I'll come up right next to that stitch, but now I can make a complete stitch, a full length stitch, and it covers up that partial stitch. And the reason, you can see the reason that when I put that needle down on a partial stitch, I kind of tuck it under. If I were to go over the stitch, it would kind of be a lump right there. So when I just go down, I just sort of angle that needle underneath the previous stitch. Depending on the arc, how drastic the arc is that you're satin stitching, you might need to do that more often, and you might need to do it more drastically. This this arc, like I said, this petal is just not that, just not really curved. It is a little bit though, especially as you get over here. So like now I'm going to tuck that stitch under. Obviously now I'm not going all the way to the center, I'm going in next to this other petal. And I'll go back to doing my little short stitches. Finish up with that one. All right, so you'll notice that my outline right here is not, it's all kind of wobbly right there, and it's a little ragged through here, and the outline on this one was ragged. Like I said, don't worry about that. That's fine because that's all going to be covered up. I really am mostly concerned on these petals what the stitches in the center of the petal look like. So don't get all freaked out if this outline is not perfect. The next thing we're going to do on this flower is a really simple, really quick step. We are going to add 3 little lines on each petal, and I'm using 2 strands of thread. And, you know, colors, you could even do random colors, that would be fine too, but I just chose, I sort of stayed consistent, like for all of the light purple petals, I used the dark purple. For all the dark purple petals, I used the light purple. And then for the blues, I just chose a color and stuck with it. So that way it was just quicker too. And so I'm on my last couple of petals. I'm using the darkest blue to add the little lines on these last 2 petals. And you know, some of them show up more than others. This one is really subtle, but you just come up in the middle of a petal, go down to the center, and make 2 little short lines on either side of that center. Or you can start on the outside and work across, doesn't matter. One more and then I'll be done. All right, so there you go. That was quick. Now we're going to outline each petal with 2 strands of the darkest blue thread and the split backstitch. So this is the part where we get to cover up all of those wonky edges that we left earlier. And I'm using 2 strands because I want the line to show up enough, but I don't want it to be really thick and, you know, kind of obliterate each petal. But I am going to make sure that I split each stitch. And because these curves are a little bit tight, I'm going to make my stitches somewhat short. You know, you don't want to make each stitch like 1/4 of an inch long because then it'll look like, it just won't look like a curve. And just take a moment to make sure each stitch is split. And I know I can hear some of you asking yourselves, can you outline it first and then satin stitch inside? You definitely could. There's nothing wrong with that, but I just find it easier, like on, I mean, there's times where you can do, certainly you can outline first and satin stitch second. I just find in these sort of smaller areas like this that I want to make sure the outline shows up, and when you are satin stitching, if you outline first and then satin stitch, you do spend some time trying not to split that outline, and sometimes the satin stitch, you know, and to make sure that the satin stitching is kind of underneath the outline, and I just didn't want to spend that kind of time, and I really want to make sure that the outline stays nice and dark, so that's why I satin stitched first and am outlining second. But it's not technically wrong if you wanted to flip that process around. All right, so all you need to do is just go around and outline each one of these petals. The center of this flower is two teeny tiny little areas, But they're pretty important because they're, kind of the focal point. Even though they're behind that box with the word, they're pretty important. But to finish the center out, we're going to stitch a right along the edge a line of split backstitch that is 2 strands of the dark green thread, and then so I've already done that, and then we're going to fill in this little bitty space that's left on the top and the bottom with little small French knots of 2 different colors. And for these French knots, I am using 3 strands of both the medium green and then the light green. But I'm only going to wrap the needle once for each knot. So it has enough bulk to it, but it's not a huge knot because I want to be able to really fill in the little bitty tiny areas in here. So I'm going to start out with the darker green. This is the medium green thread, but it's the darker of the 2 that I'm going to be using. And just start on the edge, wrap one time, go down. I'm not going to go down in the same hole that I came up in. I think a lot of people have trouble with French knots because they say their knots just, flip right back, just pull right to the back. And if you go down in the exact same hole that you came up in, then that's going to happen. Move over just a little bit, leave a little bit of space, wrap one time. I'm keeping tension on this thread. I didn't wrap it too tightly because I don't want to just choke that needle. And I'm keeping a little bit of tension on this thread for most of the way. That helps to keep it from getting really knotted up. I'm going to hop over, leave a little bit of space in between, leave some space for that brighter green. That one is a little wonky, but you know what? It's going to be covered up by the edging of the word box. Hopefully that wonky French knot will be covered up. Maybe, right? Okay, those are really sort of very wonky, but we're just going to leave it. So I'm going to now switch to the bright green thread, but again, 3 strands, and go back in and fill in those little spaces that I left. And I don't want to have any gray fabric showing, so I'm going to try to fill in without them being just piled too much right on top of each other. Not sure I'm going to be successful with that. Everything's going a little wonky here on the bottom, but I love mixing 2 colors or more of French knots in an area. I just think it's a really cool effect and really simple to get a really neat effect. All right, maybe I need one more right there, right up against that edge. That might be a little crowded, but we'll see. Oh, go back, let me try that again. Sneak that one right in. Oh, and it got caught on my needle minder. Okay, hopefully that one works. Yes. Whew. All right, holding my breath there. All right, so now I've filled in the top and the bottom of the center. All we need to do now is to put an outline around this fabric box around the word. And I am using 3 strands of ecru thread, and I am doing the chain stitch. And I am really taking my time with this to make sure it's really neat. And honestly, chain stitch is just one of those stitches that just takes a little more time anyway. It's not a stitch to really rush through. And but I'm really particularly taking my time because, this is the center. This is the main focal point of the whole thing. It's the word and the box. And I am making my chain stitches pretty small because that's just how I always tend to make my chain stitches. But it also helps to cover up the raw edge of that fabric if the stitches are a little bit smaller. If they're long and really skinny, you might see some, some of the fabric underneath. But I mean, for comparison, so you'll know. I mean, it took me 4 stitches to go from here to here. And one of the biggest issues I have with chain stitch is that these threads want to pull through at a different tension. And so I think I've found well, let me show you on the next stitch. I think so I go down, and when I pull it through, instead of leaving a huge loop like that, I go ahead and pull it so it's a smaller loop, so the majority of the thread is already pulled to the back, and then I hold it open and come up inside that loop. And now when I pull it, instead of pulling it straight up, I'm going to pull it that direction, so almost more flat to the fabric. Let's see if that works. Sort of. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And if I ever do get one of those threads that's, out of whack, if it's sitting up higher than the others, then what I do is I will come and I will gently separate each of these threads, and I'll gently pull on one and see if that fixes it. If not, I go to the next one and I pull on that one, and I can very gently tease that thread back into place. And you can see what's happening here. See how that thread is twisting around? This is one of those stitches that it helps every, 5 to 10 stitches maybe, to let that needle hang and untwist, let it spin while it hangs, and get that. Something about chain stitch just really gives it gets the threads all twisted together. So everything will go more smoothly if you can let those threads hang and get back in alignment. All right, so all you got to do for this is just finish going all the way around the edge.